Hey friends, Thor here, and in today's video we're going to be making a tier list ranking all 6 tank specs against each other heading into the War Within. This is going to be based on the testing that I've been doing on the beta, as well as what I've seen other people playing on the beta and how strong each tank looks against each other. I want to give a couple of caveats as we start this. All of this could be invalidated tomorrow with tuning changes, so please take that with a grain of salt. Also, a lot of what I'm going to say is opinions, so please do your own testing and watch other people play, do your own research, make decisions based on your thoughts and your feelings. I'm just trying to provide a framework of how I see the tanks ranking against each other heading into the War Within, as we are just a few days away from early access and just a little bit longer than that from the full release of the expansion. All of this is going to be opinion, so don't take my word for it. Go and play these tanks yourself. You can get a really good feel for how things are on live in the pre-patch right now. Obviously, hero talents change a lot, and we'll talk about how those kind of impact things as we go through the tanks here. We're just going to go through in alphabetical order. So starting with Blood DK, I think Blood is in a very good spot right now, so it's going to go in the very good tier. Blood feels sturdy in keys. It has enough self-healing. Well, it did receive some nerfs to the amount that you can do with Death Strike if you're hitting multiple Death Strikes in a row. Most of the time in my testing, that first Death Strike is all you really need to ensure that you're going to survive the next hits, and then as more damage comes in, your next Death Strike is going to be beefier. Blood is in a really good spot right now, and I think that it has a very high chance of being the meta tank. The drawback to Blood is going to be that it's usually the first tank that's going to be susceptible to one-shots. So if tank busters are one-shotting tanks at push key levels, Blood may fall out of the meta due to just taking too much damage before you're able to Death Strike to heal yourself back up. But if we're not getting to that point, if DPS or the key timer end up being the really restraining factor on what kind of keys we can push, then I think Blood has a very good chance to be the best tank this season. I have it in the very good tier, and I think it's also a very fun tank to play. It still has that very satisfying feeling of being in charge of your own survivability, which a lot of the other tanks are lacking to a greater or lesser degree right now. I think Blood is going to be very good. I like both of the hero talents for it, both Deathbringer and Sand Lane. I think Deathbringer offers a really bursty damage playstyle that's really fun, and Sand Lane has that thing that they often try to do of turning a defensive cooldown into offensive cooldown with Vampiric Blood in this case, and it just really works. I really like Blood. I think it's in a good spot, and I would be encouraged if I was a Blood DK heading into the War Within. Next up is going to be Brewmaster, and I'm going to put Brewmaster in the good tier. I do not think Brewmaster is bad. I do think it suffers in some situations from sustained incoming heavy damage. If you're playing Blood and you have sustained heavy incoming damage, you can just Death Strike it up. If you're playing some of these other tanks, you have good ways to deal with that. But Brewmaster, you can get to a point where your stagger bar fills up and you purify, and then it fills up again and you purify and it fills up again, and now you don't have any purifying brews left, and you just kind of fall over to the, again, that sustained incoming damage. Things like the first pull in Necrotic Wake, where you're trying to do this huge pull with Bloodlust and there's a lot of tank damage coming in on you. Brew can be a little bit susceptible to that. I think outside of those scenarios, Brew is still a very, very good tank. And the utility that it brings is unique, especially with Ring of Peace and being able to use that to kite, which can help you deal with those heavy incoming damage scenarios. Brew also does very good damage. I'm a little bit down on the hero talents that it has. I don't think either Shadow Pan or Master of Harmony are particularly exciting trees, and I still think that there's some problems with how fast you're able to proc your flurry strikes with Shadow Pan. I do think there are some suggestions that we could make to improve those. Maybe we'll save those for another video. We've talked about them on stream, but overall I think Brewmaster is in a good spot. I'm not sure it's going to be the meta tank because it doesn't bring as much unique utility. Death Knight brings a lot of self-sustain, which is a form of utility in a way. It also brings grips, which can be very, very good. Brew doesn't have anything that's quite that strong, and the raid buff that it brings is arguably the weakest of all the raid buffs. Although if we end up having a melee meta, which is not impossible, then Brewmaster does gain some value from that. I'm going to put Brew in the good tier. It's definitely not as good as DK, but it's good enough to do anything up to and including title range in all likelihood. Next up is going to be Guardian Druid, and I'm going to put Guardian Druid ahead of Blood DK in the very good tier. If we can get it to, we'll just move DK behind it. Guardian is very, very strong. There's several different playstyles you can go with. The Lunar Bear is going to be the strongest one, and this is what puts it up at the top of very good tier for me. It has strong defensive value while also having very high damage output. It is also an easy tank to play, and I think it benefits a little bit from that. It is very hard to mess up when you're playing Guardian Druid. You get very short defensive cooldowns. Bark Skin is about a 30-second cooldown, a little bit longer than that with the recent tank nerfs. But Lunar Beam is also a strong defensive button. You get a lot of self-healing from it, and you can get it down to an even shorter cooldown than Bark Skin if you're being aggressive with using Moonfire in AoE scenarios. I think Guardian is probably the most likely tank to be the meta tank based on current tuning. It brings arguably the strongest raid buff in Mark of the Wild, which has synergy with every class, whether it's a melee meta or a caster meta. Guardian is going to synergize well with your group. It also brings a battle res, and it's just a very sturdy and high damage output tank right now. Bear is in a fantastic spot heading into Season 1 of the War Within. If you're a Bear main, this is a really good time to play and really look to push maybe. If you're not a Bear enjoyer, then I think the other tanks are still going to be good enough to compete, but I think Bear is going to be in the top spot, at least at the start of the season. All pending tuning, of course. Next up is going to be Protection Paladin, and I'm going to put Protection in the OK tier. It could be down in... I have OK and I have needs buffs. I'm going to put Prot in OK. I still think it needs a little bit of help on the survivability side, but if you have a healer who can keep you up and you have a group that's willing to work around you as a Prot Paladin, you bring unparalleled group utility. Avenger Shield is an incredibly strong button now that stops have been nerfed and interrupts are very strong and required in a lot of scenarios. You can really carry, especially if you're doing a lot of pugs, you can carry the interrupts as a Prot Paladin. You also have things like Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Freedom, Blessing of Sacrifice, Lay on Hands. You can Bubble Taunt. There are just a ton of ways that you can take everything on your shoulders as a Prot Paladin and say, nobody's going to die right here. And that, honestly, for me, is enough to bump it up into the OK tier. I'm not going to put it in the good tier because I think it still is the squishiest of all the tanks, which is not really what you want to see, especially if you're doing a lot of pugging. It will definitely need a lot of attention from the healer to be able to survive. Shield of the Righteous feels like the weakest baseline defensive ability, I guess active mitigation ability that all the tanks have. And Word of Glory is still doing a really pathetic amount of healing on the beta right now. It's maybe like 8 to 12% of your health, depending on what kind of buffs you have rolling. Word of Glory needs another huge buff for protection. I think maybe like a 100% buff if you're using it on yourself would not be unwarranted, in my opinion. Obviously, Blizzard wants to move a little bit away from tanks being able to self-sustain forever, but Prot is just not able to self-sustain at all in its current state. It needs a lot of attention from the healer, and even with a lot of attention from the healer, sometimes you still feel like you're in danger. So Protection Paladin's going to be in the OK tier. If you can survive, again, it allows you to carry groups in a way that other tanks are simply not able to. And with a few defensive buffs, it could easily shoot all the way up to the top of the tier list. But I think the fact that it is that squishy compared to some of the other tanks puts it pretty low on my personal tier list, in my personal opinion. Next up is Prot Warrior. I'm going to put Prot Warrior in the very good tier. I'm not sure if I would have it ahead or behind a Blood. I think I'm going to put it ahead just based on my own personal enjoyment of the spec as I played it over the course of the beta. I think Prot is the most fun tank in the game right now. It is, at least for me, it's the tank that I have the most fun and that I enjoy the most when I'm playing it. It's pretty much the same as it's been for the last few expansions. If you played a lot of BFA Prot Warrior, it's going to feel like you're playing the same class. It has a defensive ability, a major defensive ability for almost every scenario you run into. It also brings the attack power buff, which is a little bit better than Brewmaster's physical damage buff. And if we end up in a place where there's a melee meta, or at least the option to play melee in the meta specs, then that's going to get a lot of value. Not quite as much as the versatility buff from Guardian, but it's going to be pretty strong. Prot's single target and AoE damage are both very, very high right now. It was the biggest benefactor of the tank DPS buffs that came in a couple of weeks ago on the beta and are now on the live servers. You do very high damage as a protection warrior, and Prot also feels like the tankiest baseline warrior. Shield block is incredibly strong. When you have it up, you are just not going to die to melee hits, which some other tanks are a little bit more susceptible to. And some of the recent changes have made almost every tank buster in the game blockable, at least if there's a physical portion of it. And that means that you're just not going to die to tank busters if you're playing the class correctly. Prot is in a very good spot. I am very happy with it, and it is going to be my main character going into Season 1, and I'm very happy with how that's shaking out. Moving on to the last tank on our list here, Vengeance Demon Hunter. And again, we're just doing this alphabetically. This is not like my order of enjoyment of the tanks. Obviously, I had Prot second to last. But Vengeance, I'm going to put at the bottom of the very good tier. Vengeance still has very good control. Not quite as much as it did, obviously, in past expansions, but Sigil of Silence is still a good ability. It is kind of the worst version that we've ever had of the ability, but it is still strong, being able to get an AoE silence on multiple mobs, especially when stops are not really a thing anymore. The ability that you have to position things with Sigil of Chains can be really good. You can do things with Sigil of Misery, especially if you think of the Xelatath, like AoE, CC, seasonal affix. That can be something that Vengeance can take care of pretty easily most of the time. It also brings an AoE stun, and I think most importantly, the damage output that Vengeance is able to do is very high right now, and the raid buff that it brings, if we end up having a caster meta, is going to be the best raid buff that there is, 5% magic damage. Even if we don't have a full caster meta, that 5% damage is going to buff things like a Frost DK or an Enhancement Shaman, or even some of Assassination Rogue's damage, which are 3 of the best melee right now. So Vengeance is in a very good spot offensively, and defensively it has very good self-sustain. Not quite as good as Blood, but the gap on that has narrowed because Vengeance did not have as much of a nerf to its self-sustain compared to what Blood got. So I think Vengeance is in a very good spot. I think it could be the meta tank again, especially if we move toward having a caster meta. But I would personally have it at the bottom of the very good tier, and a little bit of a weight to this for this decision for me is that I just don't enjoy it as much as the other tanks in this row. The 3 tanks in this row plus Brew are going to be the 4 tanks that I focus on at the start of the season, and Vengeance doesn't quite make that cut. I do think it's better than Brewmaster, which is why I have it up in very good. But at the end of the day, I think all of these tanks are in a good enough spot to be able to do whatever content you want to do. If you want to push gear keys all the way up to title range, I think that will be possible on all of these tanks. Maybe Prot Paladin would be a little bit risky if you can't survive in the keys that you need to be able to do to get to title range. But I think if it's that much weaker, it's probably going to see some buffs at some point during the season. Maybe that's not something you want to bet your choice of main character on. But I think the tanks are all in at least an okay spot. Most of them are in a very good spot heading into Season 1. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Did I overlook anything? Am I completely insane with my tanks here? Please let me know. And if you like the video, give it a like, give it a thumbs up, and a subscribe to the channel. I want to thank everyone for all the support we've had both on the channel and on the stream recently. I do stream most nights in the Pacific time zone, so if you're awake after like 9 p.m. Pacific, please feel free to check us out here on YouTube or over on the Twitch channel. Check out the Discord if you want to hang out, and I will catch you guys all in the next video. Bye.